So over the course of the past few days, seemingly out of nowhere, has been this huge story and all of these quotes getting out there about the Metroid Prime Trilogy and a possible HD port to the Nintendo Switch. There are, like I said, a couple of quotes from an ex-developer at Retro Studios who has discussed the project, the possibility of doing it, the difficulty that Retro would have in trying to bring the Metroid Prime Trilogy to the Switch, and after a few days of these quotes kind of doing the rounds, it's now kind of starting to blow up into a little bit bigger of a story. I myself first saw these quotes a couple of days ago, but it is only today, on Friday, May 7th, that now we're starting to see some of the more mainstream media of the gaming space picking this up and talking about it. And now this story is starting to spread like wildfire, that making the Metroid Prime Trilogy work on the Switch seems to be very hard. It's going to take a Herculean effort. There aren't the proper tools in place. And, you know, this ex-developer who's discussed it is skeptical that Retro could even make this happen in the first place. Naturally, this is starting to change people's mind on what they think could be possible and if they think the Metroid Prime Trilogy would ever come to the Switch, which right now is a pretty huge deal because for how long, 2 or 3 years, have we all been talking about the Prime Trilogy coming to the Switch? We want it to happen. We expect it to happen. There have been plenty of rumors and suggestions, both public and behind the scenes, that have said it has been a plan at Nintendo. And so now these quotes are kind of throwing everyone, you know, all over the place, and now people aren't quite sure how to feel about it. I myself don't necessarily think it's exactly what it seems like on the surface, which I'm going to get into because, I mean, hello, it's a Metroid topic, it's a piece of news out there, there is a lot of implications, and at this point, 7.5 years into my channel, I almost feel like it's my obligation to discuss this stuff with you because that's what I do, is I talk about Metroid. Of course, before we dive any deeper into this crazy Metroid Prime Trilogy story, I do like to remind you that I am always trying to grow the channel here on Rule of Two Review. I am hoping to cross 17,000 subscribers before the year is over. I upload several times every single week. I cover all things Nintendo, I cover all things Metroid, and I cover all things gaming. So as you watch this video, if you seem to like what I'm doing and what you hear, then hopefully you will consider subscribing to the channel. So what the heck is going on? What is it that happened? Why are all these people talking about this? And who is this guy that's talking about the Prime Trilogy? So what seems to have happened is a couple of days ago on the Shine Sparkers Facebook page, a fellow named Michael Wicken, if I'm saying his last name right, who used to work at Retro Studios working on all 3 of the original Metroid Prime games and the original Donkey Kong Country Returns on the Wii in 2010, has been discussing the fact that he thinks it's not likely the Metroid Prime Trilogy would come to Switch. He discusses some of the kind of insider developer reasons why he doesn't think it could be possible. And so, like I said at the beginning here, it's got everyone in a tizzy thinking that maybe it's not going to happen. Now, of course, before I get into his quotes and we kind of try to dissect this a little bit, I do have to put out there that right now, as of May 7th, 2021, there is no official Metroid Prime Trilogy on the Switch. Nintendo has never confirmed it, talked about it, there's been nothing that we've ever seen that shows us it actually is happening. So, for all we know, he's either right because he knows this, or he's right just because it's a coincidence. And so, yes, I think the Metroid Prime Trilogy is coming to Switch. I think a lot of you guys think the same thing. But as we discuss today's topic, we have to remember it's not yet a real thing. And so anything could happen between now and the rest of time, as far as the Prime Trilogy goes. Maybe it comes eventually, maybe it never happens. Discussing the concept of retro porting the Prime Trilogy to the Switch, here is what Michael Wicken said on the Shine Sparkers Facebook page. He says, "I was a lead designer on all 3 original games, ran the Trilogy compilation project, was a lead designer on Donkey Kong Country Returns. The biggest issue is Retro no longer has functional editor tools to work with the Prime codebase, so everything has to be, quote, brute force hard-coded. Rebuilding the hundreds of interaction sets in Metroid Prime 3 alone, not to mention retuning the gameplay to take in the slower engagement pacing of conventional controls would probably take a year with 4 to 5 person team full-time by itself. That would take a lot of effort, so I am pretty skeptical it will happen. It was straightforward to update Metroid Prime 1 and 2 to motion controls, but converting Metroid Prime 3 to normal controls would be a Herculean effort, as it is scripted very specifically using volumetric triggers to detect the motion in precise manners to do specific switches, and the bosses are tuned to take into account the ease of gestural aiming. So there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of developer coding mumbo-jumbo kind of being thrown around, and it's very interesting. It sounds very convincing. I mean, the guy worked at Retro, he worked on these games, so he clearly has the knowledge of the process. And so now is where I have to also remind you guys, and especially any newcomers here, before I dive any deeper, I am not a tech dude. I am a 40-year-old gamer who's been gaming my entire life, but one thing I've never really picked up on or dug into over my 4 decades on this planet is the super techie side of gaming. And so I'm not going to pretend to understand coding and volumetric dynamic motion gyro, whatever the heck stuff he's talking about. I mean, I know some of the most base level stuff, but mostly I've been experiencing the end product of video games and consoles my entire life over 4 decades. That's what I know. And so I'm going to use a mix of just my experience as a gamer and the tiny itty bit that I understand about this stuff to try to break this down. But reminder, I'm not pretending to be a tech guru or a game developer. I will not lie to you guys about that stuff. So anyway, I'm just going to straight jump into my actual opinion here on what he's talking about. And just to go big picture and be really simple here at the beginning, I have a tough time believing this. And I know you can laugh it off as, hey, you just admitted you don't understand how to develop games, so why would you say you don't believe what a game developer says? And I get that. And sure, maybe I'm wrong, but nothing about the concept of taking Metroid Prime Trilogy and putting it on the Nintendo Switch with the Switch's Joy-Cons seems like it should be something that would stop the process. There are plenty of other examples of games that have already come to the Switch that are already using motion with the Joy-Cons and the Switch's gyro that makes it seem like they really shouldn't have too much of a huge issue with this game. It sounds to me like there's 2 different aspects of porting these games that he lays out as being potentially difficult. One aspect is just the fact that these are 3 very large, very involved, complicated games, both visually and in terms of content. And so yes, it's a Herculean effort and a large amount of work to have to bring these games over for all these XYZ visual and gameplay reasons. The other is obviously the motion control aspect. He seems very heavily focused on the motion control stuff. And again, I'm sure in many ways he is being truthful in a lot of the things he's saying. It's not that I'm calling him an outright liar, because I don't really think that he's so much lying as it is that maybe I just don't think what he's saying is actually as true as he thinks it is. And he also says it would be a Herculean effort to have to take mostly the Metroid Prime 3 stuff and try to hard code it into like button controls for the Nintendo Switch because there's no Wii Remote and Nunchuck and all of these things. And so he thinks that it's just way too hard and would take too long to do. I do think it's interesting to note that he says it would take a 4 to 5 person team a year to do. And I'm like, well, okay, a year isn't all that long. I mean, when would they have decided to do this? At any one time, if it's only going to take a year to make the Prime Trilogy work, that's not too long of a time. And he says that would be with only a 4 to 5 person team. I'm not going to pretend to know the inside details, but wouldn't Retro be able to spare more than 4 to 5 people to make the Prime Trilogy work? And even if they did only do the 4 to 5 people, not hard to plan out a year in advance from the time you want to make your port available on that system. Obviously, a huge focus, like I said, was the Metroid Prime 3 stuff. And it's worth noting what he says does make sense in some respects. I think a lot of people forget this because the Metroid Prime games 1 and 2 did get ported to motion controls on the Nintendo Wii, and so a lot of people just kind of see all the games as the same and having the same controls because of that. But that's not really the case, man. Metroid Prime 1 and 2 have both existed with motion controls and with regular standard button controls on the GameCube. Metroid Prime 3, however, was never ever created to work with any standard button controllers and has never been ported over to that format. So, in theory, what he's saying is if you were going to port Metroid Prime 3 specifically over to the Nintendo Switch, you're having to do something with the coding and the base of that game that has never been done before, and he's also kind of trying to make it sound like it was never intended to be done. the way he describes some of it, like the bosses and the interactable sections. That's stuff that was never intended to work with a standard controller, and so that's part of what he says would be the Herculean effort. So it's almost like he's saying Metroid Primes 1 and 2 are not the reason it would be hard to port these games. He is specifically calling out Metroid Prime 3 corruption. And, I mean, like I just hinted at here, I understand that, because that is true, and it is something I think that a lot of people never really think about anymore. However, I personally believe Metroid Prime 3, along with Primes 1 and 2, could be made to work on a standard controller. They could all be made to work on the Joy-Cons with the Nintendo Switch. They could be made to work on the Switch, period. I really do believe that, even though I know I'm not a game developer. And part of the reason is because these are Nintendo's games, it's Nintendo's hardware, it's Nintendo's controller. They're in control of everything. They are wizards with game development. It's all the engines and proprietary assets that they've been working with for decades. So if anybody is going to be able to either do it themselves or hire someone else to do it, it's Nintendo. Retro Studios is even a part of Nintendo. So whether it's Nintendo proper or Retro or whoever it is, maybe they bring in another company or port studio like a Tantalus or a Panic Button, whatever. I just don't believe that the multi-billion-dollar company Nintendo that owns everything we're talking about, who are also wizards at game development, couldn't make these games come to their current console. Also, recently, Nintendo proved, I think, a lot of these theories wrong with an announcement of a small little title you might have heard of before called The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, which is now, finally, after years of debate and fighting and questioning and guessing and wondering, is finally coming over to another console, the Nintendo Switch, and there you go. That's a big deal that this game is finally coming to this console. That is a game that relied more on motion controls than Metroid Prime 3 could ever dream. They are so specifically hardwired to the core fundamentals of that game in so many ways. In many ways, actually, similarly to Metroid Prime 3, but it's such a part of that game, and that's the reason for years people thought it could never come to the Switch. I, however, had been saying for many years that I think it could happen, and now it is. And so, if we're able to see Nintendo take that game and its motion control and bring it over to the Switch with motion control mapped one-to-one to the Joy-Cons to be able to mimic the Wii Remote and Nunchuck, as well as a practical, applicable button controller interface for doing the same controls, why couldn't it be possible with Metroid Prime 3? I 100,000% think it's possible. Is it going to take some effort? Sure, but making or porting what game doesn't take effort? I mean, they all take effort. The thing is, we have to believe that Nintendo and Retro would be willing to put forth the effort and the money to make it happen. And I don't see a reason why many of us think that they wouldn't do that. The other recent release that continues to prove this as well is the Super Mario 3D All-Stars collection, which both shows the concept of taking old standard definition games in a collection made in HD, released on the Switch, as well as another way to adapt Wii pointer and motion controls to a standard controller, to a standard control interface. So you can play Super Mario Odyssey without the need for a Wii Remote or even the Joy-Cons in your hand, and you can use the touchscreen and shake stuff, and it works. There's a way to do it. So what we've seen between The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD and the Super Mario 3D All-Stars is reason to believe that even the craziest, most involved Wii Remote motion controls can be brought to work on the Switch, and everyone's happy. Of course, I could continue to go on and on about all of the business reasons, the 35th anniversary celebration reasons, the Metroid Fan E3 2021 reasons why it makes sense for Nintendo to bring this, not to mention the past 3 years of rumors as well. But I feel like I've covered that enough in so many different videos and in so many different live streams and on podcasts and whatnot. It's like, until we have anything more concrete, going into that stuff in this video probably doesn't make sense. You know all the business reasons it makes sense for Nintendo to do this. We all know about the anniversary that's happening this year, and there's a chance they do it. Yes, E3 is happening next month. That's a great time to show a Metroid Prime Trilogy. I've predicted it many times, and so, yeah, we get that stuff. I think this is more focused on somebody who worked at Retro, who knows how to develop games, worked on the Metroid series as well, who does know what he's talking about why he thinks it would be so hard, if not impossible, to do. But even though I'm sitting here as a guy who doesn't develop games and doesn't know all this stuff, You know, 40 years of just playing games and following Nintendo my whole life, I feel pretty confident saying that there's probably a better chance than what he says. Like I said, I'm not denying that it would be hard work or that it would cost a lot of money. What I'm saying is I think Retro and Nintendo are willing to put in the work and are willing to put in the money to make this happen because it is possible. That's the risk reward of deciding to make or port any video game. And it's the Metroid franchise, it's the Anniversary, it's the Prime Trilogy. They're beloved games in a beloved franchise. Whether it's hard or not, I just think they're going to do it. And we've seen proof that it is possible with Skyward Sword and Mario 3D All-Stars. So to me, all of this stuff comes together to say, I don't think it's as dire as Michael is saying, and I still believe the Prime Trilogy will come to the Switch. So these are my thoughts, opinions, breakdown, all this stuff about this crazy story. What do you guys think? Did what I say today make sense, or do you feel the exact opposite? Maybe you develop games and you know that everything he said is correct or everything that I said is correct. Whatever you think, talk about it below. With that, this video is a wrap. Thanks, of course, as always, for tuning in, guys. This is Rob of Rule of Two Review, and I will catch you next time on another video.